So what are some of the factors that affect trade in a global market besides just what does it cost us to make stuff? How much are we going to be able to sell it for in a certain area? Like, what are some other external forces you have to consider when operating in a global marketplace? And a big one is sociocultural forces, the set of values, beliefs, rules, and institutions held by a specific group of people. It's essentially what it's like to exist in that place in the world, because no two places are exactly the same. Very successful businesses cater to the needs of their customers, and a customer in Asia is going to be very different than a customer in the United States. Is going to be very different than a customer someplace in rural Mexico. So that is one thing definitely to overcome when you're doing global business, is making sure that you are indeed catering to the local customs of the area in which you're operating. Another factor is ethnocentricity, which is basically thinking that for some reason your culture is the best culture that there is. And for American products, this is definitely a mindset. There are a huge portion of people in this country that believe that no other place in the world can make goods of the same quality as American-made goods. Now, I'm not going to say if that's right or wrong, but it's definitely something to overcome. And if you are a business, say, operating out of Japan, and you want to open up a facility in Tennessee, that's something you're going to have to face. You're going to have to prove to your local market that your product is of equal or even better quality than what American companies are making in that space. So ethnocentricity is definitely a factor when deciding, do you want to expand globally to a different place? Here's some funny things on here I figured I'd throw in for the sake of humor. Slogans are a hugely popular part of marketing, and they always will be. Sometimes they don't translate as well as you would think they would, and we got 5 examples of some crazy stuff that went on over here. Coors, starting at the top, brewing company, put its slogan, "Turn it loose," into Spanish, and found out that it translated roughly to "suffer from diarrhea," not the best way to encourage people to buy your alcoholic products. Purdue Chicken uses the slogan, "It takes a strong man to make a chicken tender," which was interpreted in Spanish as "it takes an aroused man to make a chicken affectionate." I don't even want to touch on that one. Bottom right corner, on the other side of the translation glitch, Electrolux, a Scandinavian vacuum manufacturer, tried to sell its products in the U.S. market. When they translated their slogan, it came out to "Nothing sucks like an Electrolux," which the word sucks has a very connotation of not being good, so that's not the best slogan to have. Bottom left corner, KFC's patented finger licking good, when translated to Japanese, translates to roughly "bite your fingers off." And then we have Pepsi lastly, who attempted a Chinese translation of "Come alive, you're in the Pepsi generation," to read to Chinese customers as though it read, "Pepsi brings back your ancestors from the dead." So again, knowing your local region, you can't just transfer all of your branding, all of your slogans, everything that makes your company into another custom, because there's language barriers, there's traditional barriers that come in that you have to take into the equation. Another thing to take into the equation is the exchange rate. It has a huge effect on who buys from where. Currency has a nominal value if you've taken economics. It has a stated rate on it. But that stated rate is something that is conceptual. It's not real. If you wanted to go and buy a Pepsi and it was $1 and you had $2 in your pocket, you could buy 2 Pepsis. If the Pepsi was $2 and you had $4 in your pocket, you could buy 2 Pepsis. So while it costs twice as much, you still have the same amount of buying power. And the exchange rate dictates how much buying power you have in another market in your global operations. If the US dollar is very comparable to the Canadian dollar and you have manufacturing in Canada, it's going to cost you roughly the same. But if the Canadian dollar weakens in comparison to the US dollar, all of a sudden it becomes much more cost efficient for you to manufacture the majority of your products in Canada. Inverse of that, if you have operations in the US and you have operations in London, the British pound over there typically is the most valuable currency in the world. If the US dollar is strong compared to the British pound, you may be indifferent on where you want to produce your products. But if the US dollar weakens and the British pound does not, all of a sudden it becomes much more expensive for your company to manufacture out of London. So the exchange rate is something to always take into consideration, because it puts all of the money that you bring in one universal term, I guess. It's great to do a huge quantity of sales in Vietnam, but how much money you're going to bring in and how much funding that's going to give your company is all really dependent on how well the Vietnamese dong compares to the other currencies that you obtain by selling your products in other areas of the world. And that's definitely true for tourism. Every time the US dollar weakens in comparison to foreign currency, tourism spikes in this country. And every time the US dollar is very strong compared to other foreign currency, tourism suffers. And it's because people are more concerned not with the amount of physical US dollars they can translate their money into, but the amount of buying power that it gives them. It gets more expensive for them if the US dollar is strong and they have to trade more of their local currency to acquire the US dollars to be able to go to Universal Studios like this picture. So outside of just production, the flow of payments that you have, the amount of money that comes into your borders from another area is entirely dependent, especially if you're a tourist, is entirely dependent on that exchange rate. Sometimes trade isn't fair. I have a nice way to say it. There are areas of this world that don't have the best labor laws. They don't have the greatest government sanctions policies on having a safe workplace. And because you pay people less and you don't have to pay to have all that oversight to make sure that you're operating safely, it becomes much cheaper to produce in places in the world that don't have as high of a labor rate or as high of government policy. And if nothing else, companies would manufacture all of their products in these places, which is why tariffs are imposed. Tariffs are an extra cost you have to pay to import production from another part of the world instead of manufacturing it within your borders, and they are put into place to help level the playing field, for lack of a better term. They come in two categories. There are protective tariffs, and again, that's to protect U.S. business. So that is a tax put on importing products from another area of the world where it's much cheaper to manufacture it. Because yes, they're paying less to get those goods, but when you bring in the extra cost they have to pay for those tariff taxes, all of a sudden the total cost they pay to acquire those goods levels out, and it protects the American manufacturing sector. Another type of tariff they have, which can be in lieu of or in addition to protective tariffs, is the revenue tariff. And that is a tariff put on that's not there to protect U.S. business, but to help the government raise money on goods that are brought into the country from other borders. And this has been a huge source of debate for the longest time. Is it fair to U.S. workers to allow U.S. companies to manufacture their majority of their goods abroad because they can do so cheaper? A lot of U.S. jobs have been lost due to the growing number of imported products. We have definitely changed. The U.S. economy used to be a fairly equal split between manufacturing jobs and service jobs. It is definitely not the case anymore. About 5 out of every 6 jobs available in the United States are service jobs. As an educator, I work a service job. The reason being is because you can't, as of now, really import those services. You can import products that somebody else makes, but the services are stable to your area. If you need an accountant in central New York, it has to be in that area. If you want to run a restaurant in central New York, again, you have to have people operating in that area. So service business has definitely overtaken manufacturing as the predominant form of employment in the United States. Does not make a lot of people terribly happy. And the big debate is should we have higher tariffs that completely prevent companies from outsourcing? Like, what can we do to keep manufacturing jobs here? And it's a debate that's gone on for the last 30 years almost at this point since we signed NAFTA. And I don't see it stopping anytime soon. Anytime a politician comes in, it will be part of their platform that they run on. How do we increase U.S. jobs and not have so much outsourcing to other areas of the world? And it's just a part of being I don't want to sound egotistical here, but a predominant nation in the global market. One way to protect yourself is to put an embargo on things. And we have had a long-standing embargo on importing products from any communist country namely at this point North Korea and Cuba. We will not buy goods from them to bring into our country. The embargo from Cuba was lifted for a little while. Cigars came in and some other stuff, and then was put right back in place immediately afterwards. Embargoes stem from political disagreements. At the time that I'm recording this, in March of 2022, we have a temporary embargo on Russian products at this time, which means we are not importing oil from Russia, which means we are paying a mountain of money for gasoline at this time because the supply of oil that's coming in has greatly decreased from what it was before. So how does this operate? I mean, the world is a big place. Can you have trade agreements with everyone? And the answer to that is, I suppose so, but traditionally they're in blocks. Like regions of the world will come up with trade agreements for their neighboring countries. And as I was a young man, we signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Was created between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it was passed on January 1st of 1993. The reason that this was put into place is Canada and the U.S. have similar economies. Canada doesn't have the gross domestic product that the U.S. has. They also don't have the amount of people that the U.S. has. But they're both very technologically advanced, high earnings per capita countries with a lot of great resources. Mexico at the time was lagging a little behind the U.S. and Canada, and they have a huge population in Mexico. They also have a vast amount of natural resources that they weren't really making the most efficient use out of at the time. So when this was passed, the thought process was let's bring Mexico into a combined North American economy, and it'll boost job growth in Mexico. It'll fight poverty. It'll improve their environmental controls. It'll close the wage gap between Mexico and U.S. and Canada. And then they'll have more money. They'll have a better set of products. What they make will be more similar to what we make, and we'll have a better trade agreement between all three countries. And it sounded absolutely fantastic in practice. And it did not work. In 2020, they replaced NAFTA with USMCA, which is basically a revision of the agreement. They went back and they looked at NAFTA and they decided that they were going to modify some of the rules. And the big one is the first bullet that you see there. What happened with NAFTA is, as companies are want to do, they wanted to make as much profit as possible. If they had the ability to produce in Mexico, where they had to pay less for labor and less for environmental controls and all of that stuff, they would. And it created an unlevel playing field for American workers. A lot of jobs got outsourced. So under this new agreement, they are looking to level the playing field by imposing financial sanctions, for the lack of a better term, on production that is made in Mexico. And there's a term there. This is rules of origin. Sometimes it's very tricky to designate where a product actually came from. Like if you're making an automobile and all of those parts are made in Mexico, but they are assembled in the United States, is that a Mexican-made vehicle or is that an American-made vehicle? I'm not going to go into the rules because they're mind-bogglingly complex, but suffice to say, they set up the rules of origin to say that a lot more goods are American-made for companies instead of being Mexican-made, which is not as beneficial for them for profitability. Also looked to increase the profitability of American farmers in lieu of growing a ton of stuff in Mexico, etc., etc. The big one here also is digital trade, anti-corruption, and good regulatory practices. We can buy anything we want to online, and our online commerce sites are very heavily protected and regulated in the United States, not so much in Mexico. So that part of the agreement was put into place to hopefully bring that country's online presence up to the 21st century to be more in line with what United States and Canada have going on. But it's definitely one form of trade protectionism. We basically modified NAFTA to make this a fairer agreement for the United States and Canadian citizens. So what is the future of global trade? It will not rescind. Like, the world is just becoming more of a global place as technology comes on board more and more. It's going to be easier to ship products from one place to another as we make bigger and faster jets. Hell, we can even 3D print stuff from another area at our location when that technology comes into place. Global trade is going to continue to happen, and it's going to do nothing but increase over our time. So to look at the trends of what is happening is definitely something you can do to predict the future of global trade. And right here I have the growth rates of the top 10 most populated countries in the world over time. And as you can see up on top, India is going to very soon pass China as the most populous country in the world. They're very close as of now. And as you can see, their growth rate per year is exceeding the Chinese growth rate. Sometime in the 2020s, India is going to become the most populous country in the world. You can also see that those two countries are just miles ahead of the United States in third place. So a lot of products made anywhere in the world are going to cater to these two markets. I mean, if you add that together, that's 2.8-ish, 2.85 billion people between those two countries. There's only 8 billion people in the world. So you're looking at pretty close to 3/8 of the world living, and all consumers living in those two economies. You will see a lot more products made that cater to those markets. And you can see it in Hollywood right now. Movies used to have a wide variety of what hit the box office. I mean, there was a ton of very emotional dramas that were made for a low budget that American consumers would go out and watch, and studios would make them over and over again. And then Chinese film goers decided they really love special effects action movies. And there's been a complete shift, and COVID had something to do with this too. But over the last 5 years, there's been a complete shift in what films big studios are willing to make. And they're all Marvel, Star Wars, like big Fast and Furious, big high budget action movies. And the reason is that caters to that Chinese market, which is the largest market of film goers that exists in the world at this time. And India is starting to catch with that as well. They also favor the same movies. So I don't know if there's a great future for small indie dramas being released cinematically anymore. Thank God we have Netflix. Another bullet point on here, the only country that has a negative growth rate on here is Russia. And that is something that has definitely been a trend over the last decade. Is Russia's growth rate and economy is the only one in the top 25 on this list that has declined over time. So Russia used to be a gigantic economic force. They're still a very big country with a lot of GDP, but they are tailing off in the world. What is growing in terms of consumers at an exponential rate is stuff like Nigeria, with their 2.5% growth rate between 2021 and 2022. Nigeria and other African countries, have the highest population growth in the entire world. That area is lacking in technological resources at this time. There's a lot of schools that don't have internet access in Nigeria, in the Congo, in Ethiopia. And companies are going to want to put their products into that place as their economies start to grow. So you're going to see a large catering to that area of the world to bring technological resources to that area that they did not have. And a big part of that is extracting natural resources, or mining, if you will. There is huge deposits of precious metals, of oil reserves, etc. in Africa that are completely untapped. I believe that is going to be something that happens in global trade very soon, is where people make huge direct foreign investment in that continent in order to extract natural resources that can help them be more profitable in the future.